This won't surprise anyone who's taken a cursory glance at my channel, but I'm a huge fan of the Fire Emblem franchise. I've always been a fan of role-playing games, but Fire Emblem's ability to translate the RPG mechanics into a more grid-based strategical system somehow makes it click for me even harder. And while I've played other games in the SRPG genre, such as the ever-brilliant Triangle strategy, they've always failed to capture my attention to the same degree that the franchise making up about a third of the Smash Bros. Roster does. And so, when Kratos MVN recommended I check out the Final Fantasy Tactics remake, I figured it would make for a good one-off stream exploring a different SRPG, but ultimately something I would likely bounce off of. After all, I had tried Tactics Advance back in college and bounced off of it pretty quickly when I had to deal with an annoying-ass snowball fight. But, as it turns out, this was finally the non-Fire Emblem SRPG that grabbed my attention and held it. And Final Fantasy Tactics: The Ivalice Chronicles kind of took over my life for a month. Seriously, I started streaming every day of the week and didn't have any Fire Emblem in the rotation. It was just all FFT because I couldn't get enough of this phenomenal game. So let me try to sell you on Final Fantasy Tactics from the perspective of a Fire Emblem superfan. It's worth noting, I've only ever played the Ivalice Chronicles, the most recent release, and from my understanding, they added a bunch of QOL to this version that wasn't present in the previous Final Fantasy Tactics games. So if anything I say sounds unfamiliar, that's probably why. Either that or I'm getting something wrong. With that in mind, I think the most immediate difference that Final Fantasy Tactics has from Fire Emblem is the way that turns function in the game. In Fire Emblem, each army has its own turn. Every single player unit will get to make a move, and then every single enemy unit will get to make a move. This is not how things work in Final Fantasy Tactics. Instead, the turn order goes from unit to unit, depending on their speed stats. The fastest units will go first, followed by slower ones. That's because Final Fantasy Tactics operates on a clock tick system. Every tick of the clock, a unit's CT gauge will fill by their speed stat, and once it reaches a 100 value, then they get to have their turn. And because of this, the exceptionally fast units will oftentimes get 2 or even 3 turns before the exceptionally slow units get to take any themselves. You can view the turn order on the left-hand side of the screen in order to see what's coming up, but bear in mind that it is going to be dynamically shifting if there's any abilities that raise or lower unit speed stats, or impart the haste or slow statuses, which functionally do the same thing. Once a unit's turn comes around, they are able to move any number of squares equal to their movement value and take a single action. Although it's worth noting, the order in which you perform these tasks is not set in stone. You can move and then follow it up with an action, or you can take an action and then follow it up by moving. Alternatively, if you only want to move or only want to take an action, then foregoing one of these abilities will speed up how fast it gets around to you next turn. Now, if like me, your primary reference for SRPGs is the Fire Emblem franchise, you might think that these actions are fairly simple tasks. Things like attacking, trading, or maybe casting some healing spells using healing staves. But in Final Fantasy Tactics, the array of actions available to you is incredibly wide and complex, depending on what class you have. Everyone is, of course, capable of attacking with their equipped weapons, but each job has its own set of commands that you can pick from. Chemists are able to apply healing items to keep their allies healthy. Black mages can spend mana for area of effect spells to damage friend and foe alike. Thieves can attempt to steal equipment from your foes in order to weaken them, as well as have something to hawk at the pawn shop. And orders can even potentially recruit enemies to your team, including the monsters. Because all of the classes work so differently, it feels like you have a huge array of tactical options, much more complex than the typical Fire Emblem army, even when factoring in units with skills. And on the highest difficulty Tactician mode, simply attacking with your strong weapons isn't going to be enough to take down most enemies, so instead the best strategy is oftentimes to use these special abilities to inflict statuses, buff your allies, or debuff your enemies. But the cool thing about this is it means there's no one-size-fits-all solution to every single problem. If you're using mystics and orders to apply status, then anyone with a status immunity item is going to present a problem for your team. If you're trying to buff your squad with a bard, then you need to keep them out of range of any pesky enemy archers or gun users. And the same goes for any fragile spellcasters you might be using for AoE blasts. And as such, it is rewarding to train up your units to have a variety of skills and allow them to slot into different jobs depending on what tools a given situation calls for. And with that in mind, I think it's relevant to talk about this game's utterly brilliant job system. Most of the units you control in Final Fantasy Tactics are generics. There are a handful of story-relevant characters or Easter eggs from other Final Fantasy games that have unique classes, but for the most part, you're just gonna have generic moves that you can even rename. That's how interchangeable they are. So instead, what mostly distinguishes them are their starting stats and the classes you've built them into. Or technically, it's jobs, not classes. I'm probably going to use those two terms interchangeably to the annoyance of Final Fantasy hardcore fans, but you're just gonna have to deal with it. Fire Emblem brain rot be like. Every character will start with Squire, the base physical class, and Chemist, the base magical class, unlocked. And whenever a unit takes a beneficial action, they will gain an appropriate amount of experience, job experience, and JP. Experience is very simple. It controls the unit's level, and anytime a unit levels up, they'll gain stats depending on what job they're in. Although, honestly, leveling up is one of the least relevant things that you can do in Final Fantasy Tactics, as what's much more relevant is the job experience that allows you to level up your job, and the JP, which you use to purchase new abilities. Leveling up your jobs is relevant because that's how you unlock other jobs. For example, you need to get Chemist to level 3 in order to unlock both White Mage and Black Mage, and then each of these jobs must be leveled up in order to get the higher tier mage classes, like Time Mage and Mystic. There's a relatively complex and interweaving job tree into how everything is related to each other, but for the most part, the strongest jobs require you to get some experience in some of the weaker ones just to unlock their potential. Although you shouldn't disregard the weaker jobs entirely, since every single job available has at least one powerful tactic up their sleeves. Not only that, but even if you are dead set in keeping a character in a specific job, such as Samurai or Monk, there's a reason to dip into other ones just to gain additional abilities. That's because in addition to the innate talents that each job gives you, you are able to equip 4 optional skills: a movement skill, a reaction skill, a passive skill, and a command skill. The command skill gives you access to another class's command trees. So, for example, while Black Mage is capable of casting all black magic just by being a Black Mage, other classes are still capable of equipping the Black Magic command, so they can also access the Fire, Blizzard, and Thunder spells. This is most useful for classes like Calculator and Thief, who have very powerful abilities but are held back by incredibly subpar stats. But if you're trying to be more creative in your builds, it can also enable things like a Spell Sword Paladin who has access to the Knight's Sword and Shield while also wielding the healing spells from the White Mage line. But where build customization really comes into effect is by equipping passive, reaction, and movement skills. Movement skills are typically the sort of things you would expect. They boost your movement range, potentially boost your jump height because Final Fantasy Tactics also has verticality on its maps, or sometimes movement gives you a special status, like the ability to float or the ability to ignore height altogether. There's even a few movement skills that don't alter your abilities to move at all, but let you regenerate mana or HP for every step you take. Passive abilities, on the other hand, are very similar to skills from Fire Emblem. They grant you a beneficial effect that is always in play. For example, Dual Wield from the Ninja line allows you to equip 2 different weapons, so you get 2 attacks for double the damage. Concentration gives you perfect accuracy, which is super important since FFT doesn't have a defense stat, and instead enemies are bulky based on their dodge rate. There's also a lot of skills that let you equip specific weapons, such as equip axes or equip polearms, and some skills that just give you a straight up boost to a stat, such as raise attack or raise HP. Finally, reaction abilities are the closest things FFT has to an enemy phase. These are abilities that will trigger when a certain condition is met. For example, the parry ability allows you to block a physical attack when you are attacked by a physical weapon. And Mana Shield allows you to transfer any damage you would take to your mana pool. These reactions are not guaranteed, instead there's a % chance based on your bravery stat, but they are still incredibly useful and are a core part of your character's desired build. When you combine all of these ability options with the various pieces of equipment that grant different beneficial effects beyond just stat boosts, you end up with a whole host of potential build options, and I think that customizability is really great, especially since there's a variety of ways to approach the game's hardest challenges depending on your team composition. I personally went for what we were dubbing an atheist team. I had a bunch of people with low faith relying on physical means of dealing damage and eliminating foes rather than whipping out anything magical. My healers used the chemistry to apply items instead of casting spells. My primary way of buffing the team was through a bard instead of a time mage. And the way that I disabled foes was with Mustard Bonanza, a unique story character who can apply the disable and freeze statuses using his gun. My primary way of dealing damage was with ninjas, dragoons, and knights rather than anything fancier. But in watching other people's playthroughs, I saw a whole host of different strategies take place. Friend of the channel Kratos had a more balanced team with both mages and physical units, and I watched other YouTubers tackle these challenges with powerful magical nukes from summoners, or even by recruiting monsters and relying on the unique monster attacks. Playable monsters aren't customizable, instead just having their own innate set of skills, but because they require less attention than the human units in your army, they can be a sort of safety valve if things go wrong and you have some squad mates die, or just need someone to fill in the ranks for whatever other reason. But speaking of the attention you need to give your human characters to complete a build, my one complaint about Final Fantasy Tactics is it is a game that really expects you to do some amount of grinding. In the original FFTs, there were actually random encounters you were forced to do when you walked around the map, although in the Ivalice Chronicles, these random encounters are now skippable. But the campaign's level curve still expects you to spend some amount of time fighting random monsters, if only to gain enough JP to unlock the extra skills you want on your unit's final builds. If you aren't aware, I am pretty adamant that I hate grinding, especially in an SRPG. But, surprisingly, I found the grinding in FFT to actually be very enjoyable. Because the enemy squads that you faced off against were so varied with different combinations of skills and different classes of monsters, I found that each random encounter presented a different challenge to approach. And depending on the arena I was fighting in, I could take advantage of height differences or choke points, as well as potentially deploying units who were exceptionally good against the foes I was up against. For example, if I had any undead foes, white mages and chemists were a must, since they could use their revive spells and Phoenix Downs to instantly kill any undead foe. Honestly, the only significant frustration I had when engaging in optional grinding was it was holding up my ability to progress through the story, since the story of Final Fantasy Tactics was also really interesting and intriguing. I went into the Evil East Chronicles knowing almost nothing about FFT, other than occasionally hearing fans of the story claiming that it's some sort of super progressive tale that shows all of the issues with classism and potentially can be used as an anti-capitalist text. And I'll be honest, I always kind of shrugged these fans off as overinflating surface level messages because, let's be honest, a PS1 text was not going to be sufficiently Marxist, and nobody should be expecting that. So I was unsurprised to find that the class aspect of FFT is not actually a huge focus after the first act. It does definitely touch on the ideas of the commoners versus nobility, but in general, the themes of the story are more about corruption than anything. The primary antagonists are members of the church who are in one way or another super corrupt. And that corruption is taken advantage of by the Lucavi, an ancient sect of demons that are contained within the Zodiac Stones. The game's protagonist, Ramza, along with his ragtag group of allies, fight against these corrupt members of the church and save the world from these evil demons. But all of these events happen amidst the backdrop of a larger war for succession, the War of the Lions, as different groups of dukes are claiming the Princess Ovelia or the Prince Onerus as the rightful heir to the throne. Although, in truth, each of them simply intends to use their royal sibling of choice as a puppet ruler. In contrast to what you might expect from a medieval fantasy story, this war is portrayed as long drawn out and completely devoid of honor and glory, as everyone throughout the kingdom suffers the consequences of a civil war. Harvests are smaller, and bandits and monsters run ragged throughout the countryside, and of course, because so many of the nobles are busy with their self-absorbed power grabs, anytime Ramza attempts to get aid from people more powerful than him, he is either turned away or outright attacked. These nobles are so focused on their petty squabbles in politics that they neglect the commoners they're supposed to be ruling over and the true threats to the entire universe. And in the end, Ramza is completely forgotten by history despite his heroic deeds. And in case you're worried that's not a spoiler, it's something that is communicated to us in the very opening of the first cutscene. It's a really cool and honestly quite tragic story, with very interesting politics and different factions having different sort of scheming motivations, but I would say that the greatest strength that this story has is phenomenal voice acting. Not only are the cutscenes between story beats fully voiced, but even on the battlefield itself, your characters will often have things to say to the enemy faction, and these discussions are also voiced. And you can really feel the raw emotions that the protagonists and antagonists are putting in to their conflict. It's honestly such a treat, and the voice acting alone is enough to justify this remake, in my opinion. Although the quality of life certainly doesn't hurt. Honestly, this game is so good that it's made me want to take a look at the mainline Final Fantasy games. A franchise that, despite its popularity, I had not really engaged with at all throughout my life. But FFT was cool enough that I've decided to go through the series from start to finish and see what I think about these titles. I might even make some videos about my thoughts looking back on the series. So if that's the sort of thing you're interested, make sure to let me know in the comment section. And while you're down there, like, subscribe, hype, all that fun stuff. But for now, I think it's time to thank my patrons. Thank you to Glup Shido, Electric Giga, Erica Ford, YLO1, George Grenville, the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Arvis, Crispy Matthews, Floahay, Amy Hazel, Cynthia, Faulty Videos, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Anna Cabana, The Daily Fugel, Faye, Magic Bite, Thoughtful Insanity, Robin Goodfeller, Ziggy WSB, Dicyke, Chris, Root Beer Pants, Queen Eliza, Controlled Aegis, Roman Cormantic, Nick Knack Hammersmack, Carrier Has Left, Angel Nap Caceres, Cabbage, SUP, Caius Cole, Bree, Punch Fighter Champion, Eggman, Maxine the Vampire Queen, Dragonback Lancer, Sardonic Muse, Zero Gamer, Wannabe Cinnabon, Punk Tattoo Guy, Key the Iron Idol, Calamity Callie, A Clever Username of Lies, Jackson McMahon, Surin Galaxy, Rezi, Andu, Rhea, Gameboo, Carosa, Fyron, Your Doctor, Frozen Helm, Patwit, Pillow Willow, Girl Boss, Lizard Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Marin McLean, Jaden, Dylan Solis, Forever Lucas, Some Trades, Guigi555, Smaz Ruby, Zycrom, Robin D, Alenby, Hound Dogs, Theythom, Klon, and especially my Jagans, Your Best Friend 9000, Adele, Alexander Roper, Sensitive Luigi, Siggy, and Serial Bolt. If you're interested in financially supporting the channel, there is a link to my Patreon below, but please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem. But regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.